All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce our first S3D faculty speaker of the S3D seminar series. This will be Norman Sadeh, who's a professor in our department. Norman has been doing the director of the privacy engineering program. Co-director, thank you. And also in the past, the co-director of the societal computing program for 10 years and the co-founder of it. He has been working in various aspects of privacy for many years, including a startup company, which has helped bring privacy research from Carnegie Mellon out into the world. And a number of other contributions that have been adopted at companies worldwide. Today he's going to tell us about privacy in the age of AI and the Internet of Things.
Thank you, Jonathan. I didn't realize I was the first S3D faculty to present at a seminar, but it's really an honor. So please enjoy your lunch, and I'll do my very best to entertain you over the hour to come. It's an hour, right, roughly?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as you probably all realize, we're living in what people have referred to as a data-hungry economy. So pretty much every product out there, every service, every business process is looking for your personal data, trying to figure some way to add value by customizing what they're presenting to you, what they're offering to you based on that data. This is used to drive AI and machine learning algorithm. It's being supported also by an increasingly broad deployment of sensors and IoT devices. And there are all sorts of APIs out there that have emerged over the past 15, 20 years that are all contributing to these massive flows of data, where data being collected by one party flows to another, and so on. And beyond that, you also have the fact that many developers and many people developing products within this space are not always completely aware of what it means to respect people's privacy, and some of them are just unscrupulous altogether. And as a result of that, we've seen people in a variety of countries in the world realizing that perhaps regulations within this space were not sufficient. Europe in particular has been in the lead in this space, and that resulted in what is called the European General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, if you've heard that acronym. This has been followed by similar activities in a number of other countries, and also in various states here in the US, CCPA, for those of you who are not familiar with that, CPRA regulations coming out of California within the same space. And these regulations have come with a number of new requirements, including requiring that entities be more explicit about what data they collect, what they do with that data, for what purpose they collect the data, for how long they retain the data, who they share the data with, and all sorts of things of that nature. There's also been requirements in the form of giving people closer control over what happens to their data, the ability to perhaps opt in before certain practices are engaged in, the ability to opt out in other regulations like CCPA, CPRA in California, and a number of additional data subject rights, as they're referred to, DSRs, data subject rights, such as requiring that you be able to access the data that's been collected about you, look at that data and see whether potentially there are errors in this data, be able to request that it be modified, being able to request that it be deleted, and all sorts of things of that nature. And so all these regulations, in many ways, are making great progress towards enabling people to have a better understanding of what happens to their data and have some level of control over that data. And on paper, they look great. And along with that, there's been steeper penalties also being introduced. So if you've been following the press, for instance, if you look at what happens in Europe, there's been fines of as much as $750 million or euros against companies like Amazon, very significant $100 million in fines against Google, Facebook, and the like. So clearly, people are taking these things much more seriously. And at the same time, these regulations, and this will be the point of this presentation here, these regulations have given rise to new challenges that by and large have been overlooked. And those challenges have to do with the fact that, for instance, when you require people, right, to be more explicit in describing their data practices, the end result of that is that your privacy policies are becoming even longer. as I think we all know, and I'm not going to bother you with a show of hands because it's always extremely disappointing to ask how many of you have read a privacy policy in the past month or in the past year or ever in your life. Those numbers are always very traumatic to me, but not completely, honestly. But nobody reads privacy policies, and so if the major result of these regulations is that they've resulted in privacy policies becoming 25% longer. What have we truly accomplished in practice? At least from the perspective of the end user, the perspective of the consumer. You might say from a legal standpoint, we've made progress, and that's true. And privacy policies, in truth, have traditionally been written by lawyers for lawyers. That's the truth behind these privacy policies. But the end consumer, the person who ideally would be able to make some informed decisions by reading these privacy policies, has not really benefited very much. Right. The other side of this is, for instance, in terms of all these controls that users are being given, right? So if you look, for instance, at your mobile apps and your mobile phone, one of the things we've seen over the past 15 years is just an explosion of settings that have become available to you. Right now, you can decide whether you want to share your location, whether you want to share access to your calendar, your contacts list, various sensors on your phone, and all these sorts of things. And it's no longer even a yes or no type of answer that's been requested. You have the ability to say only while I'm using the application, or perhaps just prompt me every time you try to access it. So all these things are absolutely wonderful in terms of recognizing the fact that people's privacy preferences are very complex and they're context dependent, and just pure yes, no answers will not do. But the end result has been also an explosion in the number of privacy settings. My group has made a written number of articles about this, including almost 10 years ago, pointing out that if we wanted to properly accommodate people's privacy concerns in these contexts, you would end up asking a typical user to make about 200 privacy decisions. And just look at your phone. If you've not looked at it recently, look at the number of privacy settings you have. A typical user these days has between 50 and 100 apps. Each app has 2 or 3 permissions, so that number has even become larger than that. So who in their right mind can be expected, right, to actually manage that complexity? And so the point here is that while we've made great progress in these regulations in terms of requiring more transparency, in terms of, in principle, providing people with greater control, we've completely overlooked one major aspect, which is what it is that humans are realistically capable of doing, right? And so this is what I would refer to as, the human bottleneck, if you want, or cognitive capabilities, embodied rationality, if you go back to Herb Simon, right? The fact that, our brains don't have infinite power, and that has really been overlooked in these regulations. The fact that people lack the expertise, they lack the time, they lack the attention, they lack the motivation. Privacy, for those of you who don't know, is what people refer to as a secondary task. That means that most of the time when you have to make a privacy decision, that decision is not your primary task. Right? When you download an app on your cell phone, your primary task is download that app and be able to use the app. And the privacy decisions that you might make in the process are truly secondary tasks. They're not what's at the top of your mind. They're not what is going to drive your decisions. And so that's also been a very key challenge within this space here. So our group over the years has looked at some of these different issues and tried to see whether we could develop technologies that would help mitigate these problems, and also to what extent through research we could inform public policy making and help shape things up in terms of requiring potentially more stringent requirements that also recognize the true capabilities of human beings. Right, are people capable of actually doing? So one question we've asked ourselves for many years now, and we really pioneered research in this space, is what if computers could actually understand the text of privacy policies? So if nobody has the time to read these privacy policies, could we get computers to help us? That's a very simple question. And so we basically started this how many years ago now? Almost 11 or 12 years ago. And this started with trying to get human annotators to look at the text of privacy policies and start annotating different sections within the text, different types of disclosures, to try and see whether we could build classifiers based on these annotations. So we build a variety of annotation tools and ask people, typically people with legal background, to read the text of these privacy policies and say, okay, here it seems to indicate that this policy gives users a choice. or here, this privacy policy seems to indicate that some information is being shared with some third parties, advertisers, marketers, or what have you, right? And it's not even trivial to do that, as it turns out. It's not trivial for a variety of different reasons. One is that privacy policies are by nature highly ambiguous because they're written by lawyers for lawyers, right? People will never go too far in disclosing certain things. They're going to try to play it they're going to try to play a very, very careful game here. And so when you get even, privacy experts to read privacy policies, they often don't even agree on what they've read in these privacy policies. So there are lots of intricacies in trying to do a decent job at collecting these kinds of applications. But overlooking these issues, and we've written a bunch of papers on that, you can actually, subject to various types of assumptions, you can actually get to a point where you can automatically recognize a variety of different privacy statements, a variety of data practice statements in the text of privacy policies. And so we've been quite successful at doing this. There are websites where you can actually look at our results that are publicly available. We've annotated thousands of privacy policies, and you can look at that stuff and see for yourself. It's not perfect, but it's not too bad, as it turns out. And so this is an example, for instance, where you can say, okay, we're going to build a classifier to detect statements that pertain to the sharing of sensitive data with third parties. But we can do a pretty good job at recognizing those things. You can do a pretty good job at recognizing statements that have to do with what is the first party collecting, the entity that controls the website or the owner, the publisher of the mobile app. You can automatically identify a variety of different choices that are being given to users. You can identify disclosures about data subject rights, such as the ability to access or edit or delete your data and those kind of things. So we've actually done a fairly reasonable job in this space, and there's still room for improvement. So there's still a lot of ongoing research within this space. A number of others since then have followed this approach. I'll briefly mention a few different things that are taking place in industry later on based on this research here. This is an example of our website. It's called usableprivacy.org, where you can look both at manually annotated privacy policies and automatically annotated privacy policies. And so these types of colorful bars here are just basically a graphical depiction of the text of a privacy policy, where this is the beginning of your privacy policy, this is the end, and these different colors correspond to different segments or different paragraphs within the privacy policy and different types of practices, so first-party collection, third-party sharing. There's actually a typical trend in privacy policies. They're first going to describe what they're collecting, then they're going to start saying a bit more about what they're sharing. They might mention some data subject rights. They might mention some choices being given to users and the like, but it's not certainly uniform by any stretch of the imagination. And you can go fairly deep in terms of trying to identify a variety of different types of practices, what types of information, is it personal information, is it location information, demographic information, personal identifiers, and all these types of things. So you can actually go pretty deep. You can build actually a variety of different classifiers to zoom in on the different types of data practices. And feel free to take a look at this website later on if you'd like to. But let me get to, so you can also compare different privacy policies on this website and see, as you can see here, for instance, this is now shown horizontally. There's actually a bit of a pattern in terms of these colors, where you tend to actually start with this color, for instance. One thing that we focused on very quickly was the idea that, hey, if you wanted to do something useful with this, right? Because even when you've got an algorithm that's capable of understanding text of privacy policy, it's not clear what you do with that, right? I mean, if your summary of that privacy policy is still going to be 2 pages in length, you will not have accomplished very much. So we asked ourselves, well, could we potentially do something concrete that could help users? And one of the things we found out is that there are a number of choices that people are required to have in their privacy policy because the regulations tell them that they have to. But they're not very keen to expose these choices to users in a very prominent fashion. So those choices tend to be very, very, very deep in the text of these privacy policies, in particular opt-out choices. When it's an opt-in, so for those of you who don't know what opt-in and opt-out is, opt-in means that something cannot be done until the data subject has provided consent. Opt-out means you can do it until the data subject says no more, right? And so here in the US, by and large, our privacy regulations are opt-out in nature. That means people can pretty much do whatever they want until you say, hey, please stop, right? So even if you look at the laws coming out of California right now, CCP and CPRA, they're by and large opt-out in nature. There's in particular this do not sell idea, which is that basically you can sell my data until I tell you not to. So many of these choices tend to be, in fact, hidden from users, right, intentionally, because it's understood that, even though you're required to provide these choices, if, you may not necessarily be required to make them very prominent. CPRA, is actually requiring that you make that choice, that do not sell choice, very prominent, but even that is not necessarily perfectly specified, as it turns out. So we said, okay, could we at least identify, opt-out choices in the text of privacy policies, and then extract those choices and present them more prominently to users? And as it turns out, this is a task where we've been able to achieve about 90%, a little over 90% in both precision and recall, meaning that we can identify pretty much 90% of the choices that are presented to users, and we're typically accurate within 90%, with 90% accuracy or precision, if you want. And so that resulted in us building a browser extension, which is available in the Google Chrome store and the Mozilla store. And you can download it, and it's going to basically, as you browse the web now, it's going to tell you what choices are available to you. And then you can click on these choices, and you can go and basically specify those choices if you wanted to. So maybe I'll just try to quickly play a video so you don't have to listen to me all the time. Let's see how it goes. Obviously, it has to start with a commercial.
While many websites offer users choices to opt out of some of their data collection and use practices, most of these choices are buried deep in the text of long, jargon-filled privacy policies and are never seen by users. Different privacy regulations grant users the right to opt out of practices relying on the collection and use of their data. This includes the right to opt out of having one's data shared with third parties for different purposes, the right to opt out of receiving marketing emails, the right to opt out of cookies, and more. But as it stands, most websites don't offer easy and practical access to these choices, effectively depriving users of their rights. To help make opt-out choices more accessible to users, a team of researchers from Carnegie Mellon University has developed a browser extension called Opt-Out Easy, which uses machine learning technology to automatically find opt-out choices for users as they browse from one website to another. Opt-Out Easy is available to both Chrome and Firefox users. By clicking on the extension's icon, users are presented with opt-out links found in the privacy policy of the website that they are currently visiting, allowing them to, for example, opt out of analytics or limit marketing emails. Start practicing your right to privacy with Opt-Out Easy today.
All right, so very brief commercial interlude, I guess. So moving on. So we've had a good bit of press coverage based on this research over the years. I thought I would share this one page, which I find to be fun. This was an article in Fast Company about a research, which is the article that you have here. As it turns out, they had just updated their privacy policy. And so I thought it was an interesting combination of statements on the same page. But we've not stopped there. We've actually gone beyond that. So one thing that we realized we could do based on this analysis of the text of privacy policies, you could also look for potential compliance issue in mobile apps in particular. Why did we pick mobile apps? Well, mobile apps are, in particular, Android apps are particularly easy because it's pretty easy to decompile the code of these mobile apps. It's pretty much Java. And I'll tell you how we've been able to do similar things in iOS, but slightly different a bit later on. So we basically realized that, hey, if we can basically understand most of the disclosures in these privacy policies, and we can also decompile the code of these mobile apps and look at what the apps actually do, we might be able to identify some discrepancies. And these discrepancies, obviously, will be compliance issues, right? Obviously, fundamentally, if you say one thing and you do another, right, you're not being compliant. So the FTC is, responsible for enforcing basically, the need for no, what is it called? No deceiving practices, right? And so that is clearly a deception. if you are going to be doing one thing and claiming another. And so we've actually built a pipeline at some point to automatically look at over 1 million apps and looked at the code of these apps and looked at the text of their privacy policies and look for discrepancies between what the apps are doing and what the text of the policies indicate they would be doing. And the analysis, I'm not going to go into all the details of what was involved in doing that, but the story is that after analyzing 1,035,000 Android apps, we found that about 600,000 apps looked like they had potential privacy compliance issues. And on average, they had about 3.47 potential compliance issues. So it's impossible to tell for sure that the compliance issue until you do some manual vetting. Why? Because you could have some dead code, for instance, right? So you look at a code and it looks like it's doing something, but that code is never traversed. You better have, when it comes to reading the text of privacy policies, as I said earlier, different attorneys will have different interpretations of what's actually being said. But clearly a very, very large percentage of apps seem to have some issues. And that's clearly an interesting indicator. So we did a lot of analysis of all these compliance issues. And we've obviously shared these results also with different regulation agencies. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a sec. But this is an example, for instance, where we looked at compliance issues regarding the use of location information. And so the top 3 rows here have to do with first-party collection, meaning the app itself is collecting your location, but not doing a very good job at disclosing that it is doing so. And the last 3 rows here have to do with the sharing of your location information with third parties, typically advertising, right, data profiling companies and the like. And here you've got obviously the usual different categories of apps that you've got in your Android app store. As you can tell, there is a lot of red, right? And red means it's not good, right? That basically the apps seem to be doing something and the policies don't seem to be disclosing it. But what's also really interesting is to see the big difference also in the shade of the red. The darker red means bigger problem, right? Bigger compliance issues between first party and third party. So there's clearly an issue there also when it comes to disclosing what you're doing. And as it turns out, some of it is probably malicious, but a lot of it is actually directly related to the fact that many app developers have absolutely no understanding of what they're required to disclose. And they've got also a very poor understanding of what is even a third party. And I've seen this in my class. For instance, I teach mobile and IoT in the spring. I've been doing this for many years now. And as part of my class, students have to build apps, and then they've got to write a privacy policy for the apps, or at least indicate what they would want to disclose. And systematically, they run into these very basic issues. For instance, they're going to be using Google Maps. They love using Google Maps, right? Everybody who's building a mobile app somehow is always looking for a way to use that location of the user. It's just so exciting that you can actually get that, right? And then, so they've got all these location-based apps, but they fail to understand that when they're sharing the location of the user with Google Maps, they're truly sharing it with a third party. Many of them think that it's all Google, and therefore I'm not really, disclosing that location information to anybody else, but they are. So there's clearly also an issue of lack of training, lack of sophistication on the part of developers. But that's something that we've seen consistently. And the sharing with third parties is a very, very big deal in that space. So we shared these results. We originally did some work in this space with the California AG. There was actually a nice press release when the AG was actually Kamala Harris. That came out, I think it was around 2016 or 2017, something like that. And then we talked to the FTC. We said, hey, we've analyzed 1 million apps. We found about 600,000 apps that seem to have problems. They said, can't do anything with that, 600,000 apps. We don't have the resources to look at this. And so we went back and forth, compiled different results. They wanted us to basically bring that number down to something they could actually act upon. And so we built a bunch of different reports. And it was always, well, that's still way too large for us to do anything. It came down to please find the 10 most egregious apps you can identify and give them to us. And this was based on how popular the apps were, whether there were children involved, whether there was location, there was really obvious stuff. And so we sent those 10 to them, and they did whatever they did. We built different reports for other types of entities. We worked at some point, this was just before GDPR, a very large electronics manufacturer in Europe, came to us, and they had acquired, they had basically several mobile apps that they ended up with that were very popular, but they didn't really know what these mobile apps were doing because they had acquired these mobile apps as part of acquisitions of other companies. And so all the developers were gone. The mobile apps were working, but they had no idea what the mobile apps were really collecting. And so we're able to actually do some analysis for them and show them how they could go about mitigating some of the problems they had with regard to GDPR. So this approach now has become very much mainstream. It looks like everybody's doing that. Google, for instance, has started this project now a few years ago called Google Checks. That's really based on a lot of the work we've done in this space. They actually called us a number of times, asked us for advice on this. And this is, again, an environment to help developers build applications that are more likely to be compliant. And it includes looking at the text of the privacy policies. It includes looking at the code and all these sorts of things. But we didn't stop there. And so we learned from this interaction with the regulators that, hey, we can only go so far by talking to the regulators. They don't have the resources to go much beyond, 10 apps. So why not, go another step back and see if we could just help the developers directly rather than, go to the regulators. Let's be nice, right? Let's try to help people rather than wait until they make mistakes and come after them. And so we built different tools to help developers. We actually did this for iOS. So why did we do this for iOS and not Android? Well, we're a bit tired of Android. And when it comes to helping developers, as it turns out, you can easily have access to the code of the developer because now you're helping a single developer. And so you can go into the IDE and you can basically ask them to share the code with you. And then you can do the exact same type of analysis. So we've built a tool that looked at the code that developers had written and suggested or provided help to them to build their privacy policy, sort of identifying all the different types of practices that you can identify, but supplementing that also with a bunch of different questions, right? Because just looking at the mobile app is not sufficient. There's a lot of stuff that could take place, obviously, in the cloud, on the server. We don't have access to that code. And so you've got to supplement what you see in the code of the mobile app itself with a number of additional questions to make sure that you're comprehensive. Because otherwise, the last thing you want to do is basically lead your developers into this false sense that they've got something that's been supported by technology from Carnegie Mellon, except that they overlook the fact that there's a bunch of additional things that could take place on the server. Most recently, that's going to be released in a few weeks. We have also a tool to help developers write more accurate iOS privacy labels. Those privacy labels are actually also a result of research that has been done here at Carnegie Mellon. Laurie Craner has been the leader on this. I collaborated with her on the mobile app privacy labels. And that was adopted by iOS about 2 years ago now. And we continue to do research in this space and notice that developers had a terrible time actually specifying accurate privacy labels. And so we figured might as well develop a tool to help developers with that. And we'll have a release in the next few weeks for a tool that helps developers within this space. All right, so the final topic here, and then I'll move on to some other sets of issues, is I've sort of started this entire part of the presentation here trying to say, okay, nobody reads privacy policy, so let's see if we can help end users. And most of what I've presented to you is actually to help regulators and help developers. So what about these poor users, right? What can we do for them? And so we've come to the conclusion that, well, we've actually done some research on this, and we've noticed that people don't always have the same privacy questions. There's actually a lot of diversity in terms of questions that people have, even for the same mobile app. And so there's no good way of summarizing even the practice mobile app and giving users a one-size-fits-all summary, which is by and large what we've been trying to do with privacy labels, by the way. And there's a limit to that, as it turns out. And we're actually also working on on refining that concept. But we've said basically, if people have different privacy questions, why not build technology that just answers their questions? Why don't you let people ask their question and then see if you can generate an answer to that question based on what you've read into privacy? It's a very dangerous exercise, right? Because your understanding of the privacy policy is not 100%. And on top of that, the interpretation of what the privacy policy says is not necessarily going to be the same based on where the user is located. So for instance, if you are in California and you're falling under CCPA, CPRA, right? A privacy policy is expected to disclose, is required to disclose certain things. If you're in Pennsylvania, some of these same things are not necessarily required to be disclosed. And so even answering the same question, right, based on the text of the same privacy policy is not always going to be the same. It depends actually on the regulations that apply to that particular user who is asking the question. So we've actually been developing technology to do that, where we're modeling the regulations, in particular, the disclosure requirements associated with different regulations, and looking at what we can find in the text of privacy policies and combining that to then generate answers. So I've got a PhD student who is presenting her dissertation on Wednesday, actually, with results based on this research. But that's what we're doing right now in this phase. So let's move on to a different line of research that we've been involved in. And this has to do with the second part of the introduction I gave you. So I said, okay, the privacy policies are completely unmanageable. They're too long. Nobody's reading them. And then the other part was the privacy settings are way too numerous for anyone to be able to handle also. And so I'd like to spend the rest of this lecture looking at that other challenge, right? So how do we help people configure all these privacy settings? How do we help them make all these privacy decisions that they have no the ability to make based on these new regulations? And I'll start with a brief let me give you a bit of historical context here for what follows. So part of this research was conducted before Android introduced its privacy, its permission manager. So nowadays we have this beautiful permission manager in Android where you can go and toggle things on and off. But we've actually been doing research in this space for a lot longer than that. And so there was a time when you would download an app, right? At the time you would download the app, Android would say, hey, by the way, this app requires the following permissions. Are you okay with this? Yes or no? And you had that one chance to say no, in which case the app would not download. And if you said yes, that was it. You were stuck with that app and it would do whatever it said it would do. You had no ability to undo that. And so some of the research that I want to present first is actually, going back to that time where we're trying to basically communicate to Android that you should really have a permission manager, right? iOS had a permission manager, but nobody had really quantified the benefit of that permission manager. And so we did some research into that. And we did some research also into the limitations of what you would get just from having a permission manager. And so you want to sort of keep these two things in mind as I go over the next few slides here. So part of this research involved trying to see, hey, how many decisions would users change if you gave them a permission manager? All these users who had downloaded these apps and had been given a chance to decide whether or not to accept those permissions at the time they were downloading the apps, but then had no opportunity later on to change any of these decisions. And then we wanted to see to what extent, even if people had permission managers, to what extent the decisions they would make would be decisions that they were truly comfortable with. And to explore that, we decided to nudge them. So we decided to nudge them by telling them things that might potentially be sufficient to motivate them to think more carefully about privacy decisions they had made earlier. And so the types of nudges that we developed were nudges like this one here. So your location has been shared 5,398 times with Facebook, Groupon, Go Launcher over the past 14 days. Would you like to revisit your settings? Yes or no? Turns out that this is very effective to motivate people. Actually, we wrote a paper that actually had this title, right? As you know, these papers, this was presented at CAI in 2015. And we were very short. We were running against that deadline and we had hardly any time. We had not actually fully analyzed all the results by the time we submitted the abstract and the title. But we had found this one user that had shared his location 5,398 times. We said, that sounds like a nice number to have for the title for paper. When we completed the analysis by the end of the week that we had to complete the paper, this turned out to be the user who had shared his location the least. But we kept the title. We thought this was good enough. So we basically, the protocol was as follows. So we built a permission manager for Android users. And we recruited real Android users. And the protocol was as follows. For 1 week, we just instrumented their phone to look at the number of times their location and other piece of sensitive information were being shared with different apps. And then a week into this, we gave them access to a permission manager. And we told them, look, you've got this permission manager. Now you can go back and revisit those permissions you've granted to these different apps you've got on your cell phone. See if you would like to modify certain things. And then we observed what would take place over that following week. And then a week later, we started with a daily nudge, right? So, and I will show you exactly what happened. But basically, during the course of that 1 week, when people were giving the permission manager, the first day or two, you saw quite a bit of activity, and then things died down, right? And then with the nudges that started a week after that, all of a sudden we saw a significant amount of increased activity. Obviously, they saw messages like this, but it was not just about, seeing whether or not they would check their settings after seeing that. The question was, would they actually modify their settings, right? And they did, as it turns out. So it was clear that the permission managers made a big difference. I will show you that now on the next slide, but these nudges also made a very big difference. So we're not showing the first week here. So the horizontal axis is time. It starts on day 8. So the first week, nothing really happened. We just collected data. The following week here is when you gave them the permission manager. And then the last 7 days is when we started sending them a daily nudge about something that was being shared by their phone. And as you can see here, so the best color to look at is this one here, when people basically restricted their permission. So they denied something that had been allowed earlier. And you can see that the vast majority of participants denied something at some point or another. Some of them denied multiple things. And then, as I mentioned, by the end of the week, activity pretty much died down. They were done. They felt they had, done what they had to do. And the vast majority of participants here, the vertical axis is the different participants. The vast majority of people here did engage with these settings. This is the group that did not engage with the settings. So they were not terribly motivated by the availability of a permission manager. But then we moved on to week 3, and we started sending them these daily nudges. And as you can tell here, a bunch of them, including people who had modified their settings, but also people who had not touched their settings, were at that point motivated to engage with these settings and go beyond what they had done just with the permission manager. So this had a big influence on people at Android. They actually acknowledge our work. And this also had an influence on what iOS does. So iOS, even though they had a permission manager, they didn't have nudges, but in 2019, they actually introduced privacy reminders that are basically identical to the kinds of things that I've shown you here. So our work was done in 2015. This came out in 2019. And so this was another contribution in that space. So we were suddenly able to show that you can motivate people and you can give them tools that are going to increase the chance that they take advantage of these privacy decisions that are now being made available to them as a result of different regulations. But this is still not really helping people manage the number of different settings that they've got to manage. This is still very much overwhelming. So what can we do about that? And so some of the research we've done in this space is it has involved looking at whether or not there are correlations between all these privacy decisions that we make, right? So as it turns out, there is a ton of correlation, right? If you don't like to share your location, with one particular app, there's a very decent chance that you don't like sharing that location with a bunch of other apps that are very similar in nature. And if you don't like sharing your location with those apps, there's a very decent chance that you probably don't like sharing your contacts list either, and all sorts of other things. And so we basically did a lot of work on also trying to mine people's privacy preferences. Not a very easy thing to do, as it turns out, because if you just ask people how they feel about the number of different privacy decisions in a vacuum, you will get random answers. So the best way to really get meaningful answers from people is to look at what they do in practice. But even in practice, as I pointed out with the earlier research here, if you just look at the settings people have on their phone, these settings may not really truly reflect their privacy preferences unless they've been nudged in some manner or the other. So we actually did research where we nudge people to carefully think about their privacy preferences. collected their privacy preferences after they had been nudged, and then started mining that to try and see whether we could identify some interesting patterns. And we didn't go very far with the machine learning part of this because we didn't feel that there was any point in going too far. We actually used very simple clustering techniques in most of our research. A few times we went beyond that and were able to eke out a few more percentage in terms of performance improvement. But just with very simple clustering techniques, we've been able to show that often you can, and a very small number of clusters, as it turns out, so maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 clusters, right? You can actually do a very decent job at predicting many of people's privacy preferences. And so you might say, okay, that's great, but are you going to automatically, try to modify people's privacy preferences? That's not something that you want to do, right? So a big part of privacy is about agency, is the idea that you should have control over what you do, and trying to rely on machine learning to somehow, modify your privacy settings is a no-no, right? So that's not where we want to go. Instead, what we've done is we've said, well, let's generate some recommendations and let's see how that goes. And so we actually built a tool based on this. This was actually available in the Google Play Store for a number of years. And this tool required people, however, to have rooted Android phones because Android would not let us access that type of functionality. So if you had an Android phone that was rooted, you could actually use our app. And to be ethical, we actually warned people in the App Store that they should not root their phone just for the purpose of using our app. So we said, if you have a rooted Android phone, use your app. If you don't have a rooted Android phone, do not root your phone just for the purpose of using our app. This could be dangerous. But the way this worked is we would basically walk people through 3 to 5 questions that we had identified as being, sufficiently powerful. And they were not the same questions for everyone. So these questions were generated automatically based on decision trees, but we would ask them a few questions about how they felt about a small number of scenarios. And having done that, we're able to then provide them with recommendations for how they might want to modify their privacy settings. And so these things here were just indicated as, hey, you may want to modify that, but we will not tell people to do it. We will not do it automatically for them. We'd let them review it and would give them the option of accepting everything if they wanted to in one shot or just toggling things on and off individually. And so you might say, okay, how well did that work? We actually piloted this with real users on their real Android phones, rooted Android phones. We, after they had accepted our recommendations or not, we then also nudged them further to see whether they would not want to potentially modify some of the changes that they had made to see, did you just, make this change because we recommended it to you or not? We wanted to make sure that that was not the case. They had not just been nice to us, we had not influenced them. And as it turns out, the vast majority of them kept the changes that they had made. So that suggested again that, the functionality was helpful. You can never tell for sure that it's 100%, but I think in the grand scheme of things, you've got to ask yourself, how did these users do in comparison to users who would not have had the recommendations? And it was very clear that there were a number of recommendations that were accepted and that would, by far outweigh any sort of, situation where people would not have had these recommendations. Okay, this is not implemented by anyone today, right? So we actually took down our app from the Google Play Store because there was nobody left in my group to maintain the app. And we never got a huge number of downloads. We got a few hundred downloads. That was it, basically. But all the people who downloaded it really liked it. So it was actually very, very useful. So as I pointed out, only recommendations. We don't want to automate this stuff. There are clearly still ethical issues here. There might be better ways of deploying this than what we have done so far. This is still an area I think that has room for exploration here. But I think that the key point is that, and this is something that a lot of people working in privacy still have a hard time accepting. But the truth is that the number of privacy decisions that a human being has to make these days is so great that without AI, you're not going to get anywhere. Right? Privacy is very complex. I mean, these disclosures in the privacy policies, all these decisions that you've got to make, there is no way that a human being will be able to handle this manually. Right? So there's no choice. You're going to need some AI to help with this. The key is how do you deploy this AI? How do you configure this AI to truly help people without manipulating them, without getting them to do things that perhaps they would not have wanted to do? And that's obviously a very complex question. But I'd like to perhaps point out a few other things. So a lot of what I do these days when I talk to regulators and policymakers is I try to also emphasize the need for APIs within this space. So the fact that we were stuck in the Google Play Store with something that could only work on rooted Android phones, right, says a lot. This is a space where, by and large, you've got all these very big tech companies that have basically carved out a space where they are the only ones to have access to these controls. This takes multiple shapes and forms, but the same is also true even on the web, as it turns out. So, think for a minute about the number of times you've seen these cookie pop-ups where you've got to decide whether or not, to modify your cookie settings or not. Oh, annoying, right? This is a problem that's easy to solve. If you had an API that was required, right? See, if all web developers were required to recognize some signals that came from an API, you could specify your preferences just once in the browser, right? And as you browse the website, these preferences could be communicated to every website you connect to. And this would be done. This is actually super simple. The regulations do not allow for that. There's slight change, there's slight movement right now. We're talking to the California AG, and I think CCPA and CPRA will actually introduce something like that. I'm hopeful. But this is very, very slow to come. And this is only in the context of these very simple browser-based decisions. And what I'd like to do over the next 10 minutes is tell you just a bit more about some other environments where things are even more challenging in many ways. So as I've said, many privacy decisions have to be made manually today. That's clearly impractical. And the number of privacy decisions that we're going to have to make will continue to increase. So one, example of where this challenge is really, really, significant is the Internet of Things, right? So why? Well, on your mobile phone, right? You actually know all the mobile apps that you've downloaded. There's an interface that will show you all these apps. There are permission managers where you can see all the permissions that are being requested and see all the apps, and you can access all that from a single interface, your permission manager. In IoT, that's not the case, right? There might be a camera in that corridor here that's going to be capturing you as you walk by. There might be microphones. There might be all sorts of other sensors. In fact, in this building, we've got mics, right? So this is not, this is actually very, very concrete, right? So we do have, these QR codes. I think there's one right there in the back of the room, right? But how many of you even remember this, or how many of you even notice this, right? So this is not necessarily the most effective solution, as it turns out. So the state of the art in this space is roughly this, right? The question is, right? So how likely are you going to be to notice this sign, right? Does this include facial recognition? Can you tell? No idea, right? How about facial expression recognition? Can't tell, right? How long is the data retained? It doesn't say, right? Do I get to opt in or opt out? It doesn't say, right? How about exposing other data subject rights, deletion, rectification, portability, all these sort of things? So none of that is supported, right? So you might say, okay, that's not a big deal. We'll have a QR code, right? This is the solution right now, right? So QR codes are a step forward. QR codes would enable you to connect to your privacy policy, would enable you to connect to different settings. And so that's great. QR codes, I think, are not terrible. They're a step in the right direction. But how likely are you to see these QR codes, right? Unless, this whole wall were a QR code, right? You're not going to see it very often, right? So the truth is, I believe there's no choice, but you have some kind of location-based discovery process. And obviously that location-based discovery process should not be provided by Google or Facebook, right? It should be provided by an entity who is going to be committed to only doing this for the purpose of enabling you to manage your privacy preferences, to communicate privacy disclosures to you, right? But if you had that, and that would be a lot more effective, I believe, right? So with some caveats that we'll discuss in a minute. So there are ways in which you may still need to tweak that. I actually have an example of this technology running on my smartphone and actually on my smartwatch. And I've got the most lenient settings possible because I'm always curious to see how much stuff there is around me. And it beeps all the time, Right? And so you probably would not want to have it. But there are ways of configuring this differently that are actually supported today by our technology as well. So that's the quick heads up here. So we decided that in order to overcome this challenge, it would probably be a good idea to have some kind of a privacy infrastructure for the Internet of Things. And the idea behind this privacy infrastructure is that you would want to have some kind of a platform where people who are going to be deploying IoT devices that are going to collect information about you are going to be able to disclose descriptions of these IoT devices, where they're located, what data they collect, for what purpose, what type of privacy settings are available to you, and so on. And then using that infrastructure, you would have some kind of a mobile app that would be residing on your cell phone, and that would enable you to then discover all these things as you go about. And what you want to do with that is entirely up to you. Maybe you would like to configure things automatically, like you would want to probably do on your browser, right, to deal with these cookie. I mean, the fact that you want to opt out of certain things or opt into certain things is probably going to be consistent across many, many scenarios that you're going to run into. Many of these scenarios might just be identical, right? And so let's, some kind of what we call an IoT assistant deal with these things on your behalf. You don't even need to be informed about those things, but perhaps under some conditions, you would want to know about certain things, and you would want to configure, your app so that it tells you about those things you want to be informed about and not about those that you don't care for because you already know what you want to do. So we've actually built such an infrastructure. It's been running now for 2 years. And it includes basically 2 key elements. There's a portal where if you're someone who's going to be deploying an IoT resource, you have the ability to, with the help of a wizard or the help of templates, you have the ability to quickly declare the presence of your IoT resource, where it's located, what data it collects, what it does with that data, and all sorts of other things, including privacy settings that you make available to people. And the other part of this infrastructure is a mobile app that we've developed that's available both in the iOS store and the Android store. And you can download the app, and using the app, you can go and discover things that are around you, including potentially privacy settings that might be available to you. And so there are lots of challenges in developing an infrastructure like this. The infrastructure is actually available in, I think, 26 or 27 countries right now. So we've actually worked with CMU Legal to make sure that we're compliant with all the regulations in these countries. And it's been a lot of fun. And what else do I want to say? So we've actually built the infrastructure also in such a way that it's not just resource owners that can specify the presence of resources, but we also allow contributors to say, hey, I spotted this thing there, and I believe it does this. But it's not the same, right? If you're the owner and you say, I'm the owner of that resource, and this is what it does, it's one thing. And that's certainly a lot more credible than a random contributor saying, I believe I spotted something. So we've got actually ways of differentiating between that. The platform does not allow for anonymity. So people have to actually, and we verify the identity of people. And we also ask them to actually sign a statement whenever they publish something. We ask them to sign a statement indicating that this is the best of their knowledge, this is that. But those are examples of things that you're running into. We've also got templates. So for instance, if you want to declare the presence of your Ring doorbell, I have that in my home. I've got a Ring doorbell, and you can discover it as you pass by my home, right? So there's a template for that, right? You don't need, as the resource owner, to actually read the privacy policy of Ring doorbells, right? You can just instantiate that privacy policy and just say, this is where I reside. This is the, I've got a Ring doorbell, it's here, and that's it, and you're done, right? Which is a lot easier. We would like to have more participation from manufacturers, but that's the direction that we're taking here. So this is what these interfaces look like, right? So if I pick up my smartphone, I'm going to see, this is actually Pittsburgh. So I'm going to see a bunch of different resources all around, and then I can click on these resources to see what they do. Yes, we've got Spotter here in Pittsburgh. You can access that. You've got also the ability to look at basically what are privacy labels, right? So these are the kinds of things that people care about. So is the data identifiable? What's the purpose of the collection, etc. And you also have access to privacy options. Now, we do not enforce the privacy options ourselves. So we're smart enough, right? We're not the ones controlling the data, and we don't want to be known as the data controllers, which has a specific meaning under regulations like GDPR. Instead, we're doing traffic control. We're basically redirecting people. So it's all about APIs. And so what we have is we basically have the ability for people to specify the URL for their APIs. And then if you want to opt out of a certain practice or opt into a certain practice, you click on that API from our app, and then you get redirected to the entity that's collecting the data. That entity will require you to authenticate with them, right? Obviously, you want to authenticate people before you start accepting opt-in or opt-out requests. And then they can go ahead and specify their particular privacy decisions if you want. So that's how that works. We've worked very hard at making sure that this is usable by lay users. We've made this jurisdiction agnostic, right? So how do you do that? It's not super easy, but there are different regulations out there. And so you don't want to assume one particular regulation. There's a lot of interest in Europe, actually working with the European City right now. They actually have a registry for resources. And so we've actually uploaded all their resources into our infrastructure. And so there we need to be GDPR compliant, but in other places you don't, right? So we don't want to impose a particular regulation. We leave it to people to determine for themselves whether they're compliant or not. Discourage abuse, all sorts of other things. So those are examples of things I've done. I think I'm running out of time. So I'll invite you to take a look at those videos if you care to learn more about them. One of them is a 1-minute video. The other one is a 2-minute video. Maybe I'll play one of them. It's only 1 minute. And we have about 150,000 resources right now. Let's see if I can find my mouse.
Why should you use Miro?
Obviously.
When you draw on a whiteboard, no one sees it. With Miro, plan together in real time from literally everywhere. It's not just a board, it's
Our environment is becoming increasingly filled with technology that tracks more data about you. And most of the time, you can't even see them. So that's why the Internet of Things Assistant is here. It will help you with greater privacy and control of data collected about you. The assistant lives on a vibrant yet familiar interface that uses a map to show nearby data collection. By tapping on a ping, you can easily learn more about a device and even control what data is collected. With our new notifications feature, you'll be notified of any devices that you come in contact with. You can even customize when and what you want to be notified for. Now, being notified about data collection has never been easier. The Internet of Things Assistant is available on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store now, and we hope to see you there.
Right, that's a bit of a commercial. Again, we had a really good design student working for us. I don't know if you want to make sure I stop this video. Something else. Okay. All right, so let's wrap up here. So our vision within this space in general is this concept of a privacy assistant. And the privacy assistant is designed to help us manage our privacy in a way that's compatible with what human beings are realistically able to do. This includes helping us read our disclosures in privacy policies, for instance, by answering our privacy questions. This includes helping us manage our privacy decisions, maybe taking care of many of these privacy decisions on our behalf when these privacy decisions are already well specified for identical scenarios. The cookie example would be a perfect one, but there are many mobile app examples where things are extremely similar, nudging us occasionally to rethink our privacy preferences, see whether they've not changed. Those are the kinds of things that I think could add a lot of value and that could ultimately enable people to really take advantage of these regulations that have become available over the past few years. There are lots of other things I'd love to tell you about, but I don't think I will have the time. So we've done a lot of modeling in terms of how complex people's privacy preferences are. We've shown again that you can build interesting clusters, even in the context of IoT, in terms of how you could organize people in different clusters, and that basis suggest a number of different privacy decisions that they might want to make with regard to a variety of different scenarios. We've been advocating for changes in regulations that make it possible for privacy assistant functionality to become available, in particular using APIs, but also requiring some standardization. Privacy preferences are very complex. And so it's not just opting in and opting out. There are many other types of dimensions that need to be captured. And you would ideally want to have a process where authentication, discovery of resources around you, all these types of things would be standardized so that you could actually make it possible for these privacy assistants to become available. So that's in a nutshell what I wanted to share with you. basically the short story is there are new privacy regulations out there. They're great in many ways, but they're still falling short when it comes to recognizing what people are capable of doing. And our research has really been geared towards bridging that gap, and that has taken place in the form of new technologies we've developed. Some of them have influenced actual developments over the past 12 years or so, and others have been influencing decisions that have been made by policymakers, or that hopefully will be made by policymakers over years to come. And that's where I'm going to stop. So thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thank you. We have time for some questions.
Go ahead.
So first of all, thank you, Norman, for the great presentation. It's very interesting talk. So my question is, to me, sharing this sensitive information was more of a trade-off between privacy and the quality of service that was provided. So for example, a few slides before that you said, I shared the location information with Facebook 5,000 times. It's definitely scary to me. But on the other hand, when I want to make a decision about whether I want to share it with Facebook, I also want to know how does it affect the performance of like Facebook service. For example, like how does the quality of recommendation Facebook provides me changes if I stop sharing this information with Facebook? So to me, like only sharing the users with like how the information is collected and how many times it was shared, it's only a part of the picture. The other part seems to be missing to me, at least for a user.
Yes.
So I want to know like how you think about like my concern in this case.
It's a very good question. So for many, many years, people have basically tried to blur the picture, and they've tried to force you to make decisions that should actually have been multiple decisions. So for example, sharing your location with Facebook, right, for the purpose of providing you with a more accurate service, but at the same time, making that same permission also apply with whether or not Facebook can then use that location and share it with third parties, right? That typically has been bundled. So we've done a lot of research, I didn't have the time to talk about that, showing that purpose actually makes a very big difference. When you look at how people feel about these different decisions, you find that willingness to share, for instance, when it comes to improving the quality of the service versus willingness to share for this information to make its way to advertisers and data brokers, those are very different decisions. People don't feel the same way about both. But traditionally, permissions were too simple and force you to make that decision, force you to just make a single decision. If you look at iOS permissions, and this has changed just over the past year and a half. For instance, there is something called tracking at the top of, I don't know if you've got an iOS phone or not, but iOS now has introduced something called tracking, which is basically a decision that allows you to differentiate between third-party sharing, right? The sharing of your location, for instance, with third-party advertisers, data brokers, and the like, from just making your location available for the purpose of first-party use, right? So this is another way in which I believe we've influenced things in this space. So, and regulations are basically nowadays also pretty much saying the same thing. So if you look at GDPR requires you to specify all the different purposes for which information is being collected, and to give you also choices when appropriate for whether or not you're agreeing to these, to the sharing of your information for these different purposes. So basically, the quick answer is yes, this is, this matters, and this is not the same, right? And you should not be forced to, just reduce your decision to a single decision when it comes to that. Okay, thank you. Yes, go ahead.
First of all, this was a great talk. Thank you. The question I have has to do with the IoT devices end of things. I think, of course, an important thing that you talked about is the ability to opt in or out of data collection. But I don't know quite how that works with IoT devices. Let's say you have like a fixed security camera in a hallway. If you want to opt out of that and somebody else in the hallway doesn't want to opt out of that, what does that look like? The camera can't just like not record you in particular.
Very good question. So number one, those things are actually required under some regulations, right? But very few people actually offer these settings right now today. We've actually built technology, I didn't have the time to show you that, but we've actually built technology where you can automatically mask people who are not opting in. right? And you can do that in real time, as it turns out. So it's actually computationally feasible, though it's not cheap, but it's computationally feasible. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you even need to do this in real time. In many scenarios, right, people are just looking for the presence of someone at a particular location or not. So the real-time requirement is actually not really, there. For instance, if you wanted to use this technology to look, and we discussed this actually with the Eberly Center and the provost, not the provost, the registrar at some point for class attendance. You could have a system where people opt in and they would opt in with their face, right? And so this is another challenge in this space, right? So in IoT, there are many different ways of identifying people, and it's not always based on your email address and or some kind of some other or your first name and last name. It could just be based on what your face looks like. It could be based on your MAC address, for instance, right? So for instance, Wi-Fi location tracking. How do you opt out of that? Well, you opt out of that by saying, please do not track the following MAC address for my phone. That's what you would do, right? And so we've actually been building extensions of the infrastructure I've shown you here, and the idea is basically you have a collection of identifying factors, right? And based on the service that you're connecting to, you're going to provide the identification or the authentication factor that's relevant to that service. So if it's, for instance, facial recognition, you might provide your face and say, please, take this face out. It's a lot easier to do when you do opt-in. I would feel a lot more comfortable with an opt-in version of that, like saying, I'm opting in and here's my face. And if you don't recognize the face that you see in the picture, just do not record it. End of the story. Opt-in is a lot better, right, in that regard. But that's how you would do that. Same thing for MAC addresses, same thing for Bluetooth, right, all these things. So yes, there's a plethora potentially of authentication factors that you would need to use. There's no need to say, and by the way, associated with that face, here's the email address. There's no need for that. All you need to do is say, this is my face.
Okay, I guess sort of on a somewhat related note, there might be situations, I guess, also thinking of a security camera where somebody would want to opt out, but there are legitimate reasons for not having them opt out. I guess, of course, a security camera, a thief is obviously going to opt out, so they're not identified.
Yes.
Yeah.
So by and large, if you look at all the regulations out there when it comes to privacy, including GDPR in Europe, they've got exemptions for surveillance or definitely national security and those kinds of issues. What we're talking about, where those choices need to be made available, are choices, for instance, if Disney, and I think that has actually been done, if Disney, for instance, wanted to, offer you coupons, right, based on the fact that they detect you in a particular line for a particular, ride, for instance, at their amusement park or something like that, right? Then you would want to be able to either opt into that before it takes place or minimally opt out, right? So those are the examples of scenarios that we're talking about. And there are many more of these scenarios than you realize, right? I mean, we've collected many of these scenarios prior to doing the research. I didn't get a chance to present here on how people feel about many of these different deployments. People have used facial recognition for church attendance to look at, how often people come to the gym. They've looked at actually classroom attendance also. People have looked at this stuff also in stores. We've got actually all sorts of different applications out there. Even when you look at the window in a store, when you might have, for instance, some kind of a video that's being shown to you also. There will be cameras looking at you, determining your gender, your age, your ethnicity, and adjusting the kinds of things that are going to show you on the screen. Those are the kinds of practices that you would ideally want to be able to opt in or opt out of. And those are things actually that are required under some regulations, right? But not implemented today, as it turns out. So right now, there are tons of people who are not in compliance. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I really like how you frame privacy as giving agency to users. And so on that note, I did have a question about that, because a lot of times we also find that users aren't really entirely sure of their own privacy preferences, given there are so many options, and we have things like, the privacy paradox, or as Hongbo touched on, different privacy preferences in different contexts, right? Contextual integrity. So given that sometimes like users don't know their own preferences around privacy, giving them agency, right? Sometimes they don't even make the choices that they themselves would prefer. So how do we resolve that tension?
Well, I think that ultimately, you need to nudge people every so often to revisit the privacy decisions that they've made. Even not only do they not know necessarily what their privacy preferences are, until you show them what happens, you should do a better job also at explaining the implications of their decisions. So another PhD student of mine who graduated now a few years ago, did some research where we played with the way in which we frame privacy decisions. And we looked again at location as the sensitive information that was being shared. We looked at 9 different conditions where basically the sharing of your location with an app was being framed in 9 different ways. In some cases, we just say, are you okay sharing your location with the app? In other cases, we would say, are you okay sharing your location with this app, keeping in mind that by sharing your location with this app, they will probably also be able to tell where you live. And you're able to also, then all the way to they might be able to tell how much money you make, because based on neighborhood where you live, there might also be implications about the income. And you're getting extremely different decisions just based on how much detail you provide to users. So I think it's a combination of being more transparent about the implications. It's also a matter of showing people what really happens, how often the collection takes place, as we did in these nudges, and giving people, regular opportunities to rethink their decisions by nudging them in some manner. I think it's a combination of those things. It's never going to be perfect, but that's the best I've got to offer. You had a question, Jonathan, or do you want to wrap up?
Oh, I think given the time, we should probably wrap up, so I'll take it offline, but let's thank Norman again.